Press Freedom in Eritrea, which is attached to the exhibition sponsored by the Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. Thank you very much for being here. We look forward to a engaged and informative discussion about this particular topic. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. Unfortunately, due to emergency and health-related issues, Yirgalem Fisaha Mabratu and Robel Astrat could not join us, and we'll move forward with our panel with Samuel Geber-Hewitt and Meron Semedar. My name is Jennifer Riggin. I'm a professor of international studies at Arcadia University, and I have been asked to serve as moderator on this panel. So I'll begin with introductions. Samuel Geber-Hewitt was a freedom fighter, journalist, songwriter, author, and film producer. He worked for the Eritrean Ministry of Information from 1994 to 2000. He left Eritrea and went into exile in 2002. And since then, he's lived in the diaspora and continued working as a freelancer with various Eritrean media outlets. He joined and led BBC Tigrinya since its birth as an editor-in-chief from 2016 to 2021 from Nairobi, Kenya. And now he works as a freelancer to the BBC and runs a YouTube channel called Tahai Eritrea, documenting historic events in the UK. Welcome, Samuel. We're glad that you can be with us. Meron Semedar, a former refugee from Eritrea, is a human rights and international refugee advocate. Meron has addressed the UN, USCIS, One Young World, many universities and communities on the global refugee crisis and human rights in Eritrea. His works have been featured in Vanity Fair, Huffington Post, the G7, G20, the International Organization for Migrants, African Voice, BBC Tigrinya, Voice of America, and SBS Australia. A short version of his story has been published in a book called Refugees in America in 2019. He holds a South African degree in civil engineering, an MA International Studies from the University of San Francisco, and is currently a Master of Public Affairs student at the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. Meron serves as an ambassador for the Global Peace Index, the Refugee Nation, and One Young World. He works as a student advisor to MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program at the Center for African Studies at UC Berkeley. I feel very honored to be in the presence of such accomplished panelists this afternoon in my time zone, and it's very happy to be with you. So welcome to the audience. I'd like to start with a question for Meron. I was wondering if you could start off by telling us a little bit about what inspired you to organize these particular events today and the exhibit at Berkeley that accompanies this webinar. Why do you think it's important to talk about press freedom in Eritrea, and why is it important to do so now? Meron, I can't hear you. I believe you're muted.
Dr. Regan, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for moderating the session, for coming to moderate this session. It means a lot to us. I know you were Peace Corps in Eritrea. You served our people, and you did your part in trying to help the Eritrean development progress ahead. And I know you have helped many Eritreans as well right now in the US. So I want to extend that appreciation. Another sister from America, but with the Eritrean background too. So that's a privilege for us. To come back to your question, so it's been 21 years since those journalists are in jail, in prison. And they are in prison without any due process to law. They were taken in the early hours from their families, from their workplace. And at that time, it was a time when press freedom was really flourishing in Eritrea. And I was very young in those days. I don't know if Samuel could say the same, but we were very empowered. We were very getting informed about what was happening in Eritrea during those days. There were too many of them. Setit, Reem, Zaman, Ma'aleh, the list goes on and on and on. And this was a time and a moment where we Eritreans really had a time for free press freedom. They were informing us. And this time it happened just a week after 9/11 in 2001. But at the same time, there was so many other things that was happening in Eritrea during that moment. For example, the war with Ethiopia, the border was just ended in 2000. And then many politicians from the ruling party, there was only one party, even during those days, and still continues to be, there's only one party, were questioning, such as, we have to end the war peacefully, we have to build our democracy, implement the constitution, those kind of questions, and things that weren't working within them. They were starting to speak about it, and it's those journalists that were feeding us that information. It's those journalists that were giving us light to what was going on. And so the arrest of this journalist makes the start of the era of dictatorship in Eritrea, basically 2001. And ever since, all we hear is more journalists going to jail, but nobody's coming out. We don't know what's going on. Nobody can visit them. The Red Cross cannot visit them. Their family cannot visit them. We don't know if they're still alive. We don't know if they died. And they were the beacon of hope, the beacon of information, the beacon of democracy for Eritrea, because democracy doesn't just come because you implemented a constitution, but when you have journalists informing the people. Yes, many things happened since then. The political dynamics of the region, the country in its own, there's so many going on around us. But their lives matter. They are brothers to some of us. They are colleagues to some of us. They are fathers to some, husbands to some, friends to many of us. And what happened to them? It's the right question to ask. It doesn't matter whether it's 21 years since that day or if it's happening every day. We have to question those questions. The other thing is this. They are the longest serving journalists in prison as we speak. They have been the longest in prison. It's not right. Their lives do matter. They're not just statistics. They're not just names. They deserve the right to live, the right to express themselves. And the fact that press freedom was killed with them being in prison, ever since, what we see of Eritrea is not any peaceful. All we see is people running away, people disappearing, people going to prison without any due process of law. So there is zero accountability. So when they were giving us that information, there was some form of accountability. So the question is, how do we get back to that era of accountability? And that's why we're standing for them. We also try to connect this event with UC Berkeley's free speech movement of 1964, an era where many students stood up for their freedom of speech. And that era of advocacy have contributed greatly to the rest of the world on press freedom. So this comes in line with what's happening in Eritrea for the last 21 years. Yeah, there is so many reasons, but the most important one being their lives matter. If they've committed crime, they should come in front of due of law, and we should hear what their crimes are, and we should go forward with that. But they're just taken to jail without any process of law. So that's what we're standing to commemorate their arrest, their contribution to building a democratic and prosperous Eritrea. And deep down, just in the basics of humanity, they are human beings. Their lives matter. That's what we're trying to say.
Thank you so much, Meron, for reminding us of that history of what happened 21 years ago, reminding us of the humanity of the journalists who are in prison, and explaining why it's important that we're holding this event at this time. Samuel, do you have anything that you'd like to add to the comments that Meron made about why this event is important at this moment?
Yeah.
I believe you're muted. Samuel, can you unmute? There you go.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much for attendance, and Meron for initiating this, and Dr. Jennifer Regan for inviting us to discuss about what's happening in Eritrea for the last 21 years, especially for those journalists. It's hard to remember, to be honest. Yeah, it's hard. Whenever I recall those events since 21 years ago, I feel kind of unashamed and embarrassed for myself and for my compatriots who could have fight for their release and freedom. Whenever I invited for such kind of webinar or gathering, I feel embarrassed, as I said, because I think that they haven't done enough to advocate for those journalists whom I know closely, many of them my friends and my colleagues. This story may raise curious questions. How could it happen, or how could it possible for someone like them to be imprisoned for 21 years without any process of law? But it happens in Eritrea, and that is the sad part of the history in our country. When I think about my friends and former colleagues, the veteran journalists who disappeared, the time Meron mentions, September 21st, as I said, I feel pain because I know some of them and their friends, their relatives, their daughter and sister. So it's hard to remember these journalists in this time. Even though many human rights advocates and journalists like me write about what happened to them and their families is beyond human imagination. We have done nothing more than highlighting their plights in writing and social media campaigning. The fact that their whereabouts still remain unknown, and it is not even known that how many of them are dead or alive, is an indication that our attempts and actions are inadequate. Yeah, that's I can say for the time being.
Thank you so much for your comments. Just as a follow-up question for you, I was wondering if you could comment on if you had the chance to know any of the journalists in prison, and if so, can you recount anything about your time with them?
Actually, some of those journalists, I know them from long years. I was not detained in prison, so I didn't know them in prison, but I know them in person, some of them. For example, I know Johannes Joshua during the armed struggle. We were in the same brigade in the combat. At that time, Johannes was a songwriter and actor for our brigade cultural troops. What I remember is the first time that I saw Joshua was during the night. We came from our trenches to watch the cultural troops, music and drama show designed to lift the fighting spirit and morale of the freedom fighters. That night, perched on the bottom of a mountain, we looked to the stage light only by an oil lamp. And it was here for the first time I saw Joshua. It was in 1982. He was playing an act with the message of, "It is worth to die for the security and the continuity of your people." I like and admire him for his courage and determination. I was inspired by Joshua and his colleagues' cultural activities. I developed an interest in art. And at the end of 1919, I left the trenches and was assigned to be part of the cultural troupe with Fasahe. Became in the same team. We became friends and worked closely together in a Platon Ganta. Every aspect of life is shared. Day and night we are together, eat, drink, sleep, wake up, work or rest, travel, everything we endure the same. Sometimes we are good about matters relating to work, learned from each other, employed methods of criticism and self-criticism introduced by the revolution, and moved on. Sometimes we fight and sometimes became friends, as any human being. During the War of Independence, we organized shows in different parts of the country for the army and the people to lift their morale and raise their hopes and aspiration. Joshua and I were separated during the 1992 reshuffling after the independence. However, we met regularly and discussed work-related and social issues until he was arrested in September 2001. It is 21 years now since he disappeared. He is believed to be in a good forsaken hell in Era prison. Every time I remember him, I am taken back to the love we shared, the conversation we had, and the comrades and friendship we shared. I also met the famous war photographer, the legendary Siyum Tsahay, in the trenches of the Dandan Mountains in 1986. I was young at that time, maybe I was 18 years old. When he accompanied a British photojournalist called Jonathan, I don't recall his name, but I am looking for him till now, this British journalist, because he took us a lot of photos for myself and for my team. There were in Dandan. In Dandan, for our audiences may know some of them and they may not others, it is a strategic mountain near the historic town of Nakfa, which was liberated in 1977 once and for all. Dandan had seen some of the bloodiest battles during the years of attrition. Then I was a radio signal operator for the company station on the mountain. These British journalists came to document the daily life of the smallest unit squad, and Siyum was helping him as an interpreter and guide through the dangerous trenches. Fast forward, we both survived the war, and after independence, by chance, we met at his family house in 1991. I met his fighter sister Mulu in Assad. Then we came back to Asmara. She invited me to her parents' house, and we were having coffee with her mother and father. Then Siyum joined us, but we didn't remember each other. When we met another time, I asked him if he had come to Dandan with a photojournalist in 1986, and he immediately remembered me. After that, we met regularly. We worked together. In 1996, I wrote a drama titled Confession, and Siyum adapted it into a film. We also collaborated in similar efforts to adapt my other drama, Life with Faith, into a film. Finally, when we were planning to adapt another drama, Defense, it is into a film, I felt ill and went abroad for treatment, and we remained separate ever since. However, although we were separated physically, we remained together in spirit. Between 1996 and our separation, we met regularly. We used to travel together, we used to work together, and we used to discuss about the political and social relates of our country. We exchanged ideas and wishes that we thought would lead our country to the road of development. While wishing the best and dreaming about great goals, some of us into exile and others into endless exile. And I know the others, Tamaskan, Abu Arre, and the law. So I might come later to discuss about whom I know and how. I think I will give chance to Meron.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear you talk about your longstanding relationship with these journalists, and especially to note that these were people that were working along with you for the liberation and for the betterment of the country for so many years prior to their arrest. That's really struck me in everything that you were saying about them. Maron, do you have anything else that you'd like to add? And I'm particularly interested to hear from both of you, if you could talk a little bit more about the history of constraints on press freedom in Eritrea, particularly if anyone is listening in who's not particularly familiar with that. And if you could talk about how it evolved, where it came from. Were there always constraints on press freedom, or was it something that came suddenly? Was there always a desire for the work that journalists did? Or was that something that was unusual in the summer of 2000, right before their arrest? Just if you could put all of this in kind of a broader historical context for us. And Maron, you spoke to this a bit earlier, but do you have anything to add? Please make sure to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't think I could add much to what I added earlier on. Maybe Samuel would have a very good recount. I was young during those days. All I know, my attachment to those newspapers was that there were many, and we would, in the afternoon or around 1 p.m., we would rush to buy whichever one we really liked. There was some of them for talked about politics, interviewed politicians. There was some of them about love. There was some of them who had many poetry kind of materials. So people were hungry to go and buy the newspaper because some of them had this extension for the story that they are waiting for. So, but from a point of how did this come about to be, and what was the progress to September 2001, maybe Samuel could say more about that.
Okay. Thank you, Mara and Dr. Regan. Yeah, what I want to elaborate is, for example, I can talk about myself. When I was joined the Ministry of Information as a journalist, I like kind of an assign, because we didn't take any journalism training, or we are not coming from an education of university or high school with the journalism. Just we came by passion and inspiration to be a journalist, and we joined the Ministry of Information just to serve our people with the news and information. So there is not much kind of guidance in the Ministry of Information at the time. What we believe is most of us we are freedom fighters, and we thought this is a continuation of the struggle for we fought for independence. This is for freedom. So we believe that the Eritrean government and the Eritrean people are the same, and they need the information for their development and betterment in life. At the beginning, I didn't see any restrictions. Let me share you one story. Yeah, one day I write a story criticizing the government. It's related with the corruption in the administration. So I presented to the editor to publish it. But when the editor read the story, he refused to publish it. And I was very upset and said, why? Why we didn't publish this story? And I became so angry and argued against the decision. Then the editor tried to calm me, and he said, listen, you can't write a criticism article in the government that feeds you, he said. I was so upset. So I told him I had never understood that way. So I felt that he was an apologist of the government. And I told him, I'm going to resign and demobilize. This was my protest. So he told me that you can try, but there is no demobilization. He was right. Up to now, there is no freedom of choice in Eritrea, especially then, if you are a freedom fighter, that choice is considered as a luxury. But later he advised me to be patient and said, we will need patience when the right time comes. Later in 1996, the Eritrean press law became a reality. Soon after it was published, several private newspapers, as Meron mentioned, Setit, Kastadabana, Maqal, Tsigyanai, and many others. So they created a platform for discussion and sharing the ideas. What I was expecting, and many people was expecting, at least the articles we can't write and publish in our government media, we can write on these newspapers, and many of us writing in the pen name in these newspapers, thinking to correct the wrong issues or the wrong administrations. But the government didn't tolerate. Instead of supporting them through training or financing, he tried to kind of obstacle them with an access of information. Finally, the government has banned all private media in September, as all we know, and all the journalists detained. This is the situation in Eritrea. One party, one man show, no tolerance of different opinions, just kind of a dictator, no listen the other voices at all. That's why he detained them for 21 years without due process of law. That's the reality in Eritrea. People should know. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks so much for your answer. It's so interesting. So many of us think of that moment in 2001 when the private presses were closed and journalists were arrested, what we've been talking about, as this sort of watershed moment that changed everything. But what you're describing is actually a much longer history of a strong desire among journalists to fight for freedom of the press, freedom of information, ability to get stories out to people, and people's desire to have information, and also a long history of trying to repress that goes way further back than 2001. It seems important to me for people to understand that long history, because the way the story is often told is that 2001 was just a process that came out of nowhere, that it started, and of course it was a very pivotal moment, but it had come out of a long process. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Even what I want to add is one thing is I mentioned this in some part of kind of gatherings that then Minister of Information Barak Gabraselassie, now he is detained in Eri with these journalists. He was a political figure with G15. He tried to help those private journalists and the private media. He thought this is the reflection of our country and of our people, and we are going to help them. There are individuals, even in the ministry of in different ministries and in the governments, they are thinking and advocating for the free press in the government. That's why many of them detained along these journalists for 21 years without any information in this hell Eri.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. A follow-up question for you, and you've talked about this a bit also, but you worked for the Ministry of Information in Eritrea and worked in journalism in one capacity or another. You've also worked as a journalist outside of Eritrea for various news outlets, including the BBC and many others that I mentioned when I introduced you. I was wondering if you could compare and contrast the experience of being a journalist in Eritrea with the experience of being a journalist elsewhere. It's clearly a very challenging job wherever you do it. When you're a journalist, you're always going to be held up for criticism. But if you could talk about what the experience of being a journalist in these different settings is, I think that would be interesting.
Okay, yeah, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I was working as a journalist in Eritrea, just without any basic training, but later on we trying to get different kind of short courses in training, and we joined also in 1996 for the certificate program in University of Asmara, but our capacity, our knowledge, and our experience was limited. And we work, as I mentioned, we work as kind of a propagandist journalist in Eritrea. We believe that we are serving the country. We are not forcing to say this or not, but when we try to correct the wrongdoings in the Eritrean media, we are not allowed. Later on, I left the country and I went to exile, and I work with the different media outlets for Arena, Medrek. This is kind of an opposition media, and this is the other extreme, and also criticizing the government. So there is no kind of a balancing story. We are not pure journalists in both sides, whether in Eritrean government and whether in exile. In exile, we are campaigning against the government who is doing wrongdoing, the abuse of human rights abuses in the country. But when I came in the BBC is a different media outlet, it's international media outlet, and I was learned to be an impartial journalist. I was guided by the law of the BBC, and I was learning a lot, and I'm glad joining for this 4 or 5 years working with the BBC and still working as a freelancer. But when I work as a chief editor of BBC Tigrinya, I learn a lot, and I know what could be the journalists, pure journalists in the international media. So that's the different. Journalists should be impartial and balanced, credible, gather information from the credible sources and present to the audience. Otherwise, it's not allowed to be a propagandist. So always keep balancing this kind of experience. It's not easy at all. And I'm glad to have that experience in my life. Yeah.
So that's really, I think that's a really important point, that getting to that point of impartiality is very important. It can be very challenging sometimes, of course, because information is often subjective, and journalism is also a short form compared to sort of the kind of academic writing that some of us do, where you have a lot of time to make your argument. In journalism, you sort of have to make your point very quickly and based on the facts that you have. But impartiality is, so it takes a lot of training, and it takes a lot of work. That's very interesting for you to talk about those different perspectives of being a journalist for the government, being a journalist for the opposition, and then being a journalist in this more impartial kind of outlet. It's very interesting. Let me ask another follow-up question, and this is sort of a question that might be a critique that might be running through a lot of people's minds, and I'd love for both of you to comment on this. Many people might argue that in a place like the United States, for example, where we have a lot of press freedom and we have a lot of access to information from a lot of different sources, people might argue that that creates other problems, that it's become too hard for everyone to discern between information and propaganda, that there's accusations that the news is biased, the news is slanted, the news is fake news, that come from all different sides. Do you think that there can be too much press freedom? Can press freedom cause problems? And how is the situation in a place like Eritrea different than maybe the situation in a country like the United States with regard to press freedom? Meron, do you want to give your thoughts on that and give Samuel a little bit of chance to rest?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Let's go back a little to Eritrea. It's we used this, and I've heard this joke among the Asmara University students who, like when Asmara University was around, they couldn't get a lot of things done because it's a small country, very small number of population, and people somehow knew each other. So why am I saying this? In a place like Eritrea, if something is done and there is room for it to get in front of the news, it's easy to clarify whether this is true or false. In a place like the United States, it's a massive country, big number of population, but it goes down to the bottom of it by accountability. There should be a means of accountability, and there should be retribution for wrong information as well. I advocate for that. Yes, the question of where the propaganda and having honest news, the two major outlines in medias in the US between CNN and what is the other one? I'll remember it. Fox News is that sometimes it depends who you're listening to, which audience you are from, and it can always get twisted and things like that. but people should be given the right to choose which information they should be listened to. Yes, there should be a credible investigative unit. There is investigative journalism that's growing, not only in the US, but also in Africa as well. I used to live in South Africa, and one of their major journalists was at the investigative unit, boiling down things to the bottom of it. And things like that should grow in African setting as well. In short, there is a way to make sure that the right information passes to the people. And to a certain degree, it is the role of the government to hold people who pass in misinformation accountable. And I advocate for that personally as Meron. Right now, how news is passed in Eritrea is somebody says something and it just blows like a wind. Maybe the other person adds something to it, and it just keeps going like that. There is no any form of institution in Eritrea, even to hold journalism accountable. There isn't any form. So having too many media is better than not having any media at all, which is the case right now in Eritrea, because whatever happens, people don't know what's happening. Even if there was a bus that was flipped on the side of a road somewhere in the country, most people don't know what happened in the country. And it's such a small country with a small number of population. Everyone should know about what is happening. I'm just making that as an example. There is so many wrongdoings in this government. People have been tortured, people have been imprisoned without any due of law, and there is no accountability to it. And it's journalists like those who are in jail that could have given us light to what's going on. So I would strongly advocate for as much as possible journalism and openness of journalism. When you open multi-journalism media in a country, one is also going to criticize the other. You know, if one is given the wrong information, the other one is going to try to give her the right information. So people have the choice to make based on the information that they're receiving. So it doesn't hurt. It in fact builds democratic institution. In this country, we have journalists questioning presidents to the degree until they get the answer that they are looking for. And immigrant journalists as well in some cases, not American-born journalists. So to me, journalists are the beacon of hope, the beacon of information, the beacon of democracy. And I think it's to a certain degree very difficult to accomplish or to live in a sense of democracy without journalists. That's how I would define it or understand it. And
yeah, there's many important points that I think you raised, which is the role, and this has been a theme that's come up a lot in this conversation, the role of journalists as an accountability tool. And what you're describing is really a system of checks and balances, where the government needs to put some checks and balances on journalists through press laws and things like that to make sure that they're doing responsible journalism. But it's also important that those checks and balances are not so restrictive that you can't have press freedom, because journalists also play an extremely important role in providing checks and balances on the government and on accountability. The word accountability has come up several times. So I think that's a very important concept, that journalists are able to ask hard questions. They're able to share information. They play an extraordinarily important role in holding all governments accountable. So I appreciate, I'm just summarizing the different things that you've said.
Yeah. And running into their arrest, that's exactly what they were doing. You know, there were political figures in the ruling party, the only party, that started to speak up about the wrongdoing of the government, that we should prioritize, one, for example, peaceful means of ending the war with Ethiopia, and two, we should work on our democracy, meaning there was a ratified constitution of 1997 that was never implemented. So they were saying the border war is now calm. Let's work on it on the side, but let's build our country into a democratic Eritrea, into the things that we need to do. Yes, it's not yes, it was sort of a new country, but 10 years was not easy. The war was calm at that point. So they were raising the right questions at the right time to be able to move the country forward. And it's those journalists that were bringing that to light. And it's those journalists that were given accountability to what was raised, a genuine question. And the government didn't want that. The current government, or the government that we saw since 1991, didn't want that. And yes, that was the accountability part of it from their part that those journalists try to give us. And ever since, there is no accountability. All there is a one-man, one-party show. If they want to arrest you, they arrest you. If they want to get rid of you, they get rid of you. If they want to put you in jail, they put you in jail. And that they do that without any question, without any due to court of law. And people's life doesn't actually matter. They do whatever they want with your life. So that's where we are. For example, the indefinite national service is a good example. Initially, it started with 18 months of service. It has become indefinite. It has become a lifetime. So many young people's life were consumed in this indefinite national service, and nobody is holding them accountable.
Thank you for that. Samuel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, what I want to add is, I think Meron mentioned this about the freedom of press. And your question was that too much freedom of press might be a problem, like in America and else in the world. My position is press should be free, but it could be accountable. Currently, what we see in Eritrea, you can't mention about the press. It's almost nothing unless the government media. Unfortunately, this time, Eritrea is involved in a war, civil war in Ethiopia. We don't have any information what's going on in Eritrea. There is a lot of roundup, a lot of preparation for war and involved in a war, but the government doesn't give any information for the society. And we, the people, live in exile. We don't have any information. We listen, or we get the information from the Ethiopian media. In Ethiopia, relatively, the media is open because there is social media, a number of YouTube channels. They tell us the story, but it could be one-sided, as the war is an ethnic war in Ethiopia. But it's better that it's nothing. Sometimes those YouTube channels from the Ethiopia side, they might add fuels into what's happening in the ground. We see in the last 2 years, it's very tragic in the YouTube channels. We see people is burning live before they died. We see people was killed and thrown away with the cliffs of mountains. That's the bad side, and there is a hatred speech as well in the media. But you can make completely accountable for such kind of medias to restrict them in creating hatred among the society. But media, in all, should be free and be accountable. That's my stand for the media.
Thank you. That's a really useful set of examples that we don't even need to go as far as the United States to sort of look at questions of press freedom. And again, the theme of accountability is very important. Another set of issues that have continued to come up during this conversation is the relationship between press freedom and other issues. For example, due process, the fact that journalists were arrested without any formal charges, have been in prison without any term limits on that. They've never been formally charged. And this, of course, is a theme that often comes up when we talk about press freedom in Eritrea. Another issue is the general lack of civil liberties, the lack of restraints on time limits in national service, and just the general sense that people don't always have control over their lives, that there are not basic civil liberties. I was wondering if both of you could speak a little bit about the way press freedom connects with these other really important issues, particularly the lack of due process, the right to a fair trial, the right to be sentenced fairly, and just general civil liberties issues in Eritrea. What's the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, to me, there is nothing relationship between this. It should be a relationship if once was accused, so it should brought to the court within 24 hours, then he would allow to have his own solicitors and get free trials. But unfortunately, in Eritrea, there is not such kind of things or opportunity. All these journalists and the G15 who was detained at the same time, they were disappeared for 21 years without any due process of law. So that's the very dangerous thing in Eritrea that's happening. They will never visit their family. They will never see their families. They will never receive any medical treatments and no letter at all, no communication. They are completely disappeared. And I don't know whether they are alive or not. We heard some news from some guards who left the country. They were guarding them. There is rumors, some of them they might die, some of them might ill, but we don't have any clear information about these things. So that's why this government is a completely dictator government. It takes the rule at his own hand and he do whatever he likes. That's why the Eritrean people and the Eritrean elites who fought for this inhuman treatment of such prisoners. That would I would say, yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I could have added to this is, had the press freedom that sort of started in the 1996 and onwards continued, I think we would have seen accountability. I think we would have seen great progress. I think the fact that all this media was cut off on September 2001, that was a huge blow to progress, not only on press freedom in Eritrea, but also to the whole future of the country, from democracy, from progress. You know, some of those people were journalists, like real journalists that went to school for journalism and got their degree. Imagine a journalist comes out of studying journalism, and if he or she cannot practice journalism, or only they can be is a puppet of the government, and they cannot criticize anybody, which is the case right now. There's only one government media. You cannot criticize the government. You can only glorify or just say, I mean, basic things, what's happening. Then people are living in a complete blank space. They're not getting the right information, and there won't be any progress until there is such press freedom to give people accountability and the information that they need. And so 2001 truly did mark the era of dictatorship in Eritrea. That's how I usually see it.
Thank you. That's an interesting connection to make about accountability and the importance of a free press to advocate for due process and for civil liberties and other things. So they really do all come together in those ways. Why do both of you think the Eritrean government feels the need to constrain press freedom? And I'm curious if you both know if the government has given any rationale for this, or if you wanted to speculate as to what's accomplished by constraining press freedom.
Just shut up the society, because press freedom is, if the society have the press freedom, they can discuss the issues, what's going on in their country. They can criticize the government, and they can mobilize the population for what's going on in the country. That's why the government wants to shut down all the press freedom, and they want to listen. One ear just was coming from the government propaganda. He takes that country for 21 years. For example, when he closes the press, he said that is for temporary, but unfortunately, temporary went indefinite. So whenever the government became a dictator, when a dictator government wanted to hold or strengthen its power, the first thing they do is close down all the media outlets and shut the free press.
Thank you. Meron?
Yeah, I think Samuel said it all, but they knew what they were doing when they shut down all this press, all this media outlets or this newspaper medias. They knew it's a one way of controlling information. And they have been controlling information ever since. There is only one TV station, one radio, one newspaper, all 100% controlled by the government. All it does and serve is the interest of the only government that existed. They control the information, they control the agenda. And on that basis, think about it, 21 years is not a small amount of time. It's a child is born and 21 years old. By the way, some of them, in particular, one of them, Dawit Hatta Mikhail, I believe, have a daughter somewhere that's in Europe. She's 21 years old. Her mother was pregnant with her when her father was taken away. She doesn't know anything about her dad. What am I trying to say is, there are young people, young Eritreans who are 21 years old. Technically, they are adults in the way how we see an adult person above the age of 18 in Eritrea. But all they know is an information that's fed to them by the Eritrean government-run medias. Now, you can imagine how much they are thinking. Their mindset is so controlled by this media. So it's not just about information, it's also your horizon, your way of thinking to the world is controlled, is really put in such a small box that they own. That is what they developed. They developed a generation that's controlled in the information that they receive. There is no internet. It's very difficult to get internet in Africa, in the entire Africa continent. If you're going to struggle to get internet, it's Eritrea. So even with this world of globalization and a world that seems coming very smaller because of technology, Eritrea is not a part of it. So this younger generation of less than 25 years old don't have any clue outside what is given to them by the Eritrean media outlets. So to me, it's not just about the media is being shut. It goes beyond that. You're controlling people's thinking, the right to liberty, the right to think freely, the right to dream is not there. How can you dream when all you see, all you know is given to you by one government, and all they want you to think about is there is a threat from a neighboring country that goes on for decades. And that's how they're controlling the narrative. That's how they control the agenda. That's how they control the people. And that's where we are. And it's not just about, yes, the media could have opened many doors in knowledge and information. Like Samuel mentioned, people could have gotten the right information to question what is wrong or to air their voice. But to me, it goes beyond that. Controlling the private media is controlling the people. And that's exactly what they did. And when people cannot take it anymore, they burst, and their only way of freedom is to run away. And that's what they're doing. And I tell you, I recount this. When we get to Sudan, we run away over the border and we go to Sudan. Like just seeing even the different kind of drinks, Pepsi, Mirinda, and things like that. Like we felt we are just in a treat for a different world. You can imagine how much our brain was so controlled that all we know is what we know. And the moment we step out of that country, then our horizon starts to open up. Where was I? Today, Eritrea is, for the people that are not in jail, it's still open prison. It's prison. Even if you are with your family living in a city or something, you are still in prison. The entire population of Eritrea who live inside the country is in prison. That's how I define it, because there is no way for you to even imagine with your brain to use it to think what's out there or to be able to connect with the rest of the world. None. So it goes beyond.
He said well, Meron, he said well and elaborated well what's happening in Eritrea regarding the information. For example, the National Service, when it starts in 1994 with a goodwill, we thought it's a goodwill just for 18 months. I was one of the advocates of that National Service. And the first article was written in Hadas Eritrea, was my article. It's saying it's good to serve the country for 18 months because, as I mentioned when I met and saw Johannes Joshua, it's good to die for your country and your people's betterment. That's the continuation of building the nation. But later on, what have done the government is when this all criticism is coming, is completely shut down all the private newspaper and controlling the use. And they, with this no end of national service, they took all 11th grades into the national service in Sawa. They studied their 12th grade there. Completely, they are kind of brainwash what's going on in the country. They only receives from those government cadres. They don't have any other outlets to see the outworld, as Meron mentions. For example, when he went to Sudan, we were surprised by Merenda and the other things that's in Sudan. This is a big reflection what's going on in that open prison, Eritrea.
I think it's very important what you're both talking about, because sitting where we are right now, it's hard to get your mind around what it's like to have information so restricted, right? That we live in this era of information where we're almost saturated by information. We have information accessible to us all the time. And I think both of you have done a great job of explaining what it's like to be in a place where your access to information is shut off. And it's not just about press freedom, but it's about developing a consciousness that you have from being able to access information. It's just a very different way of thinking about things. And I think that that's important for people to understand when we take up this idea of press freedom in Eritrea. I only have, I think I've mostly asked most of my questions. I have one more, but before I ask it, let me give both of you the chance to add anything else that's come up for you in this conversation that you think that's important to mention. Do either of you have anything else to add?
For me, I have a list of those journalists that are in prison, and I want to say a few things about them. They're not just numbers or names. They're individuals like us. I try to picture it. Where would they be had they not been in jail today? Like I mentioned earlier on, some of them have children. Some of them were very young to even reach that age of marriage. I mean, they could have, but I guess they thought they have their life ahead of them, and their life was cut short. This is literally what has happened. Their life was taken away from them. In 21 years, maybe some of them could have been fathers, seen their children graduate from colleges. That is what is taken away from them. They're not just journalists. They husbands, they fathers, they brothers, sisters, they colleagues, friends. And we have to recognize that. And in fact, to a degree, the Eritreans that are out there, the privilege we have that we still are breathing, and the fact that we could even talk about them in a way, I want to humanize them. They have a soul. They have a soul that's been stolen from them. I wish we could have been joined by one of the panelists, Yergalem Fesaha. She was in jail for 6 years. They've taken 6 years of her life. For what? for being a journalist. And that is what is happening. And I know there is so many things going on within the political dynamics of Eritrea and then the region, as early on Samuel mentioned, the war that's taking place. But beyond that, those people were arrested in jail in 2001. And they were arrested for just being journalists. Like you've been an engineer or a doctor or something, they've just been arrested for being a journalist. We were trying to get a medical doctor to be in this panel. He couldn't make it because of safety issues. He was a prisoner, and he was a prisoner, the journalist doctor in prison. He was a prisoner himself, but at the same time, he was the medical doctor for the prisoners while it's still in prison. It's that degree, a prisoner being a doctor for other prisoners. So I would like to call their names, say a few things. Hamid Muhammad said, his date of birth is not described. He was a very soft-spoken, technically minded, and he did not socialize so much. According to his former colleague, Hamid, they call him CNN as a nickname, was also another targeted journalist incarcerated in Communicado for undisclosed charge. He was arrested on 15 February 2002, but he has never been brought to a court of law. And the Eritrean government has denied clarifying his whereabouts until now. And then Suyum Sahaye, I think Samuel mentioned a lot about him. He is a former freedom fighter, the first director of the state-owned national TV channel, Eri-Tv, and a freelance photographer, journalist. And I believe Suyum has some children that are in the diaspora. Am I correct, Samuel?
You're right,
Suyum?
yeah.
How many children does he have?
He has 2 children, and they are doing well in their education. The one is doing her first degree, and the other is doing her master's. They are doing well, yeah.
Okay. Again, they live in the diaspora, not inside the country. You cannot do that even. You cannot choose what master's degree to study in the country. And then there was Saleh Idris Said. They used to call him Al Jazeera. He eventually disappeared in February 2002. He was working for the Arab State Radio. And Idris Abi Arre, there was this famous quote that he said that the strange thing about the matter is that every time that discontent and content resurfaces, the stubbornness of the ministry grows. So he was technically speaking up about the ministry of, probably the Ministry of Information. He is married and has 1 daughter, and he remains in prison. Madhani Haile, he was a deputy editor of Kasta Dabana. He said this famous quote, "We are in a country governed by the rule of law, and we are asking for an explanation for these actions. We cannot flee in fear." And you know, when I read Madhani's quote, that's exactly what we did. We ended up feeling in fear. So we just let down Madhani in his words, in what he believed and in what he stood for. Amani El Asrat, he was the editor for Zaman. He was an award-winning poet, and he said the ugliest of the thing of war, when it springs, comes when its ravaging echoes knock at your door. It is then that the scourge of war brews doom. That was Amani Al Asrat, brother of Robi Al Asrat, who's supposed to join us for the panel. And then there was Sahle with the Itai, that was his nickname, Sahle Tsagazab. He was a veteran freedom fighter. He worked in various capacities in military intelligence after joining the revolution in 1974. He had a legal expertise. He wrote critical articles, were some of the most read and balanced pieces during the heightened period of political discussion. This is basically between 1998 until 2001, until the arrest of the G15. That's Sahle Tsagazab. And then Dawit Isaak, mostly people, they know him as the Swedish Eritrean journalist. He was taken into prison in September 2001. He was briefly released in 2005, but again, he was taken back. He was a poet. He used to own the city. He was one of the co-founders of Showit Children's Theater. So he was also helping children into theater. Then there was Yusuf Muhammad Ali. He was among the first editors to break the long silence and culture of secrecy by conducting an interview with the then Minister of Local Governments. As we talked earlier on, the first journalist that gave us light to what was happening within the ministry and the government. So Yusuf was among the first one to do that, Yusuf Muhammad Ali. And then there was Jimmy Kimmel, an Eritrean Jimmy Kimmel. He was born in Karura and fled to the neighboring Sudan at the early age with his family to escape the ongoing war. He completed his secondary school in Sudan, received a scholarship to continue his studies in Libya. He was active in the student movement, eventually joining the armed struggle in Eritrea in 1989. After Eritrea's independence, he continued to work for the Ministry of Information. He was detained on November 24, 2005. And then Matthias Habtab, he was a journalist and mathematician. And among his colleagues and readers, Matthias was known for his courageous stand, his refined editorial, and as a person who speaks truth to power. Matthias was a conscript in the Eritrean Defense Force at the time of his arrest. Until now, nothing has been heard of his whereabouts. He was arrested on September 23rd, 2001. And then there was Temasgen Ghebreyesus. He was a comedian. He was a band leader. He was a sport editor and self-trained cameraman. Temasgen, who was a father to a son, was conscripted in the army before his arrest in the morning hours of September 23rd, 2001. In addition to his duties as a journalist, Temasgen also acted in some of the most acclaimed plays performed in the country. Like other journalists, his fate is unknown. And then there was Gabriel Kaleta. He used to report for Sigenai. He was arrested in July 2000 before the political crackdown. That was Gabriel Kaleta. And then there was Fisahaye Joshua Johannes. He was a poet, a playwright, journalist, co-owner of Setit. He was rounded up in the morning of 23rd September 2001 at his home. David Hapta Mikhail, I know he have a daughter somewhere in Europe. He was the assistant editor-in-chief and co-founder of Makaleh that started in December 29, 1998. He was a physics teacher in Asmara at the time of his arrest in September 2001. So many of these journalists actually they wore multiple hats. They were teachers, they were journalists, they were doing other things, but they really loved doing journalism, and that's why they took it as a second career or as a second. Well, in many cases, for many of them, like Samuel said, they were contributing to the building and betterment of the country. And then there was Said Abdel Kader. He was taken to prison in September 23, 2001, along with other journalists. There hasn't been any official clarification about his whereabouts by the Eritrean authority. He was editor-in-chief and owner of the independent newspaper Hadas Admas, The New Universe, that was founded on May 1, 1999. He was also working as an international news editor for the government-owned daily Hadas Eritrea. So some of them were also working in the Eritrean government-owned Hadas Eritrea newspaper while they were doing their private newspaper as well.
I just want to correct you one thing, Meron.
Yeah.
Some of the journalists that you mentioned is about 5-6 of them, I think, they are working for the Ministry of Information, like Jim Kimmel, Al Jazeera, and Saleh CNN, and then now you mentioned
Said Abdul Qadir.
Yeah, no, Said Abdul Qadir, yeah.
Yeah, it says that they were doing, they were working for the Eritrean Hadas Eritrea newspaper at the same time, while they were also contributing to other news media outlets.
Yes, sure, yeah. Some of them, they might contribute with a pen name, but it's not allowed with their real names. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that.
The most important thing is there is a number of journalists, not only for the private press, even for work in the government, they were detained and disappeared, and they never brought to the court of law.
Yeah, and it's good. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you for reading out that list and telling us more about each of those individuals, both because, as you say, it's extremely important to humanize these people. We're talking about the concept of free speech, but these are also human beings who have been in prison for decades, and it's important to get the human aspect. But I'm also struck as I hear this list that these were people who played a lot of different roles. Some worked for the Ministry of Information, some were teachers, some were poets, some were playwrights. But they all were doing this work because they strongly believed that this was a way to make the country stronger and better. That we know democracy is challenging. It's difficult to build a country for every country, and they had a strong dedication to that. And I'm also always struck how many of them had also worked for the liberation of the country, and so this was an extension of that really important work. To build the country that preceded independence, even in some cases.
Yeah, true. Many of them were freedom fighters, like Samuel was, and then you can see how much nationalistic they were, and how much they want the better Eritrea, how much they want to contribute to empower people, how much they want to move that progress of prosperity and development and democracy forward. They were wearing multiple hats. They weren't just doing a job. They were doing, and by the way, Samuel can speak to this. They barely make money out of this. They're just doing it out of the spirit of wanting to educate and empower people.
Yes. Nothing at all in Eritrea for this kind of work. No one can get money, especially for most of them. Actually, they also contribute from their own pocket to publish their work. So that was the reality in Eritrea. So they are not working for money, they're working for their inspiration to be the betterment of their people in the country. On this opportunity, I just want to mention one thing. So we, even though our topic is about the free press in Eritrea, there is people who are detained together with the journalists. They know about, they are known about G15 and the other cadres who are detained. Those people also, the high quality in the government. Actually, they are ministers, generals, and department heads, kind of things. They question the government of the way heading forward. So they think, they ask the government to be implemented democratic, constitutional democratic government. Then they were detained along with these journalists for almost 21 years. So it's good, and it's obliged to remember them in this opportunity.
Thank you. I think if we still have time, I'll ask both of you one last question. I think this event is extremely important to be informative to people, to keep the memory of these journalists alive, to honor the sacrifice that they made. What other things can people who are listening to this and are interested do to make sure these journalists are not forgotten, to honor their sacrifice, and continue to recognize the importance of press freedom?
Well, in the case of Eritrea, we did this exhibition for 2 days at UC Berkeley in front of Caesar Gate Crescent. It's when in 1964 the free speech movement took place. Graduate students at UC Berkeley stood out for their press freedom, for their free speech. And by hosting this event, what we're trying to do in a sense is that for people,
I believe
it's back, yeah.
Samuel, would you like to pick up? Oh, you're back. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm back. Sorry. Okay, so I was saying this event. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So this event was a 3-day event. We did an exhibition about it in front of the Caesar Gate Crescent, the main entrance to the UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley entrance. And it's historic in such a way that the 1964 free speech movement started in that environment. So we're trying to connect it that free speech is so important. It's what moves the country forward. But on the basis that what people could do, if we could do this in a small way, people to recognize that this is part of what is missing in Eritrea. This is part of what progress is taken away from us. Imagine if those newspapers existed until today. It could have unfolded many information. It could have helped in building a democratic Eritrea. It could have empowered with information and knowledge many young generation. It could have created even jobs for many upcoming journalists and others. And what people could do, there is an organization called Pen Eritrea. People can familiarize with the work that they're doing. They can also tweet about this event, about press freedom in Eritrea. They can tweet about the release of those journalists who are in prison without any due of law. That is what they can call out for. And also to look into the future that someday we would have press freedom in Eritrea. That's at least my hope. Beyond that, it's a very close country. It's a very close country, and I want to encourage people to go to the root cause of why we are in this situation. Not only by the journalists being in jail, but why are we fleeing our country? One of those journalists earlier on mentioned about this famous quote, which I felt we let him down actually in his message, and I'll try to get it in a second. Madhani, which he says, we are in a country governed by the rule of law, and we are asking for an explanation for those actions. We cannot flee in fear. Now, the part where we are governed by rule of law, I don't think so there have been any rule of law in Eritrea because that constitution was not implemented. But the part where it struck me about what he said is that we cannot flee in fear. And that is what all of us Eritreans have done. We fled in fear. And I agree with him, we cannot flee in fear. And that is one of the mistakes that most of us did. We should have fought on the ground against this government, and then we would have been in a better state, because we already in thousands of numbers, we died in the Mediterranean, in the Sahara Desert, in the Sinai Peninsula. Had we fought on the ground, we wouldn't be in this predicament. So I would encourage everyone to ask themselves, why is Eritrea in this state? And also challenge everyone to do their part. to be advocates for democracy, because it serves all of us. I don't know, Samuel, if you can add anything.
On top of that, what I want to add is, for example, the government of Eritrea wants us to be forgotten these people. In Eritrea, after they are arrested, they will never brought into the television, even from the work that they have done, from the history they have done. They try to remove it. Their names, their photos, their images, everything. This kind of events is remembering for what they have done for their people and their society. It's really great, and thank Meron and you, Dr. Regan, for initiating and organizing this kind of events to remember them. It's great. Last year, we have done the same, like what he have done, Meron, this year in London with the Focus Africa and Amnesty International, PEN Eritrea, and the other organizations. We made an exhibition and with a short bio of each individual who was detained at Era prison. So this year also is great to arrange such kind of event by Meron and yourselves. So we Eritreans glad to have such kind of brave young generation who can take their country into the better future. So I admire Meron and all his colleagues at his age to take the responsibility of what the journalists and the politicians paid for their life, for the country.
Before we close it, Dr. Regan, one thing I want to say is, one, I want to thank you for taking your time out of this Sunday, out of your family time to come and host this and moderate this event. I really thank you so much. But also, there have been some individuals and many programs at UC Berkeley and organizations who co-sponsored this event, and I would like to just call out the name of the organizations and programs at UC Berkeley. The Center for African Studies at UC Berkeley, the university itself, the University of California, Berkeley, the African American and Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley, the School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. The Othering and Belonging is one of the biggest organizations that's housed at UC Berkeley as well. The Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, Berkeley Law, the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, and also the MPAs for Justice Empowerment, PEN Eritrea themselves for providing the material and advocating for the release of those journalists, Setit Media, Erisat, and Asena Media, and also Samuel for coming to be a part of this panel. I just want to thank you. Also, Yurgalem Fisaha, who couldn't be with us here today, but she was very instrumental in being very supportive. I want to thank her as well for making this event happen, and thank you all for your time as well. So thank you so much.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor to be here with you. Meron, thank you so much for organizing this event. And it's been a tremendously informative conversation. And thank you so much also for your participation.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.